Lawyers of Reddit. What was the most movie-like twist you've encountered in a case? Dog bite case. The defendant's dog was running loose on a trail and attacked a jogger. The defendant was representing himself and was trying to show that he had no idea that the dog was dangerous. He took the stand and immediately opened with, "He had only ever bitten my son, but I didn't think he'd bite people." Not a court case, but as a very new lawyer in Las Vegas, I was helping my boss with a wealthy client who was very old and incapacitated. We were meeting with his wife, a former showgirl, and his son, not the child of the wife, about how the estate was set up and what would happen when the man died. The son was doing his best to show that he was serious and responsible and that he was prepared to take care of his stepmother. The moment the man died, the son skipped town with all the money and a stripper, exactly the way Hollywood would have scripted it. I've told a couple of stories I'm a little tired of repeating, so I will go with an experience of my ex-wife's. She was called for jury duty and selected. They were told it was an auto accident case. When the trial started, they were given facts already established in a separate legal matter related. Car A was traveling at the speed limit when car B tried to make a left turn in front of them. They misjudged basically everything and caused the accident. Police on the scene found the driver of car B at fault and established car A made more than a reasonable effort to avoid the accident based on tire marks and witnesses. Car B's insurance settled all claims. So why the trial? The passenger of car A was suing the driver of car A. He was her boyfriend at the time and her baby's daddy. She broke her front teeth when she face planted into the dash because she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. That fact was highly in contention. She adamantly insisted she was, but the boyfriend admitted on the stand she was not, and they had lied to the police about it to avoid a ticket. The most bizarre point was after the two women that were in car B testified in the plaintiff's favor. They walked over to her and hugged her. My ex heard her say, "Don't worry baby girl, we gonna get you paid." They however did not get her paid. Edit to answer some questions. She based her suit off the premise driver A could have avoided the accident. She adamantly denied she was not wearing a seatbelt. The people in car B testified on her behalf that he didn't even try to not hit them. Driver A had the officer on the scene testify he measured his tire tracks from braking and said he couldn't veer to either side because of a deep ditch on one side and another approaching car on the other. Now but I know some lawyers. One woman found out her husband left some money to some woman she doesn't know and tried to get the money. She forced the woman to get a DNA test. Then her kids did the same to show that they were his kids and she wasn't. Results come back and the woman was the guy's daughter while her kids weren't. 5 children from different fathers. Big scandal in my hometown and she went from tolerated to despised, and her kids kinda got depressed over the revelation. 2. My dad had a legal battle with his ex and her new boyfriend. Boyfriend was suing claiming dad broke into his house and beat him up and ran off. My dad, ducking, comes in a wheelchair after having knee surgery and having his legs be fitted with metal braces. Couldn't even stand up. Boyfriend confessed to making it all up so he and the ex could get money. 3. My aunt tried to sue me for a piece of land she thought her parents gifted to me into a will. I didn't want it coming out that I bought the land because they were broke, but were too proud to ask for money. It also turns out my aunt owed a lot of money and promised that piece of land to her debtors. My mother was a witness in a lawsuit one of her friends did to his own son. The lawsuit: he gave his house as a present to his son so that he doesn't have to pay tax for it, as in my mum's friend. Since it was now the son's house, he wanted to sell it to get an apartment for his family and an apartment for his dad as the house was old and falling apart. My mum's friend didn't like that idea, so decided to sue his son to get back his house. Keep in mind that he legally gave his son ownership of the property and thinks now he can do take-backs because he changed his mind. We were going to a settlement conference with the plaintiff and a federal magistrate. I walked in with my client, the defendant, and we were sitting at a conference table. The magistrate and a court reporter came in. Then the plaintiff, who was alleging permanent disability due to damage to both knees. He had been deposed and swore he could only walk with crutches. The magistrate doesn't even start the conference. He wants to see both counsels in his office. I'm thinking, what the heck is this about? Magistrate informed us that on the way to his office he was crossing the street. A young man he identified as a plaintiff walked briskly past him carrying his crutches. The reserve on the case was $300K. Saved a bunch that day. Once a client decided to confess during deposition that the doctor had encouraged her to hit the brakes and cause a car accident because of all the insurance money the doctor would get, and she could get free chiropractic work on her back. Also, doctors being busted for telling patients they had cancer and they didn't. A lot of people at the hospital were in on it for the insurance money. Lastly, a blood clotting medicine that caused spontaneous anal hemorrhaging which killed a lot of people. Had a paternity case few years ago. Guy wanted testing for his 2 sets of twins. When I asked him why he wanted a test, he responded, "My dad died last year." His answer made no sense, so I asked again why he wanted a test. He gave me the same reply. So then I ask, "What does your father dying have to do with your request for testing?" He begins to tell me that after his father's passing, he was cleaning out his father's house when he came across his dad's cell phone. Wanting to read the last conversation with his father, he opened the text messages his father kept. He found messages between the mother of his children and his dad that were sexual in nature, and he assumed that maybe his father was the father of the 2 sets of twins. I was so shocked that I didn't even finish cross-examining him. I immediately turned to the woman and said, "Is this true?" She looked at me, looked at him, shrugged, and said, "Could be." Testing was granted. As he was leaving the courtroom, I heard the kids ask him, "Did you win, Daddy?" One of the worst cases I ever had, and he was not the father. His dad was, and she still wanted child support from this guy. A couple of years back I was assisting a client in a matter relating to his refugee visa. He had fled almost 2 decades before, following an unlawful, ethnically motivated imprisonment of himself and other family members, which resulted in the death of his father. By the time the client and I met, he had sustained a brain injury amongst other things, and so was difficult to talk to. Said refugee client turned out to be the godson of the former president of the country that he fled from. Said president was directly responsible for a genocide. During initial consultations, he did mention his family members, including his godfather by name, but just failed to point out that he was, in fact, the president. As I continued researching the other family names he'd given me, one after another turned out to be a high-level instigator of that genocide. Some were convicted. Some still have outstanding warrants for arrests by an international criminal court tribunal. It was shocking, to say the least. In the end, I just did my job the best I could and left it up to the court. Not a lawyer, but my divorce case. Ex-wife put me through 5 financial disclosures, depositions, subpoenas, stress, all because she was convinced that I was hiding money from her. I literally make 10K more than she does. That's it. Finally, after 1.5 years, I found a bank account of hers she was hiding from me with 30K in it. When my lawyer saw that, his mouth dropped. He said, "Okay, this next letter to her lawyer will be the last one." She ended up losing everything she wanted and paid my 25K lawyer bill from the 30K she was hiding. My lawyer came to my divorce booze cruise party and celebrated with me and got wasted, lol. Update. And I only pay $175 a month in child support. Oh, I've got one. I was handling a case years ago involving a challenge to a deceased's will. My client was one of the 2 adult daughters of the deceased old lady. The will made shortly before death. When the deceased was known to my client to be very frail and confused, left 2/3 or 3/4 of the estate to the other daughter, who had become closer to the deceased and taken over much of her care. A previous will divided the estate equally. There was no reason why my client would have been treated any differently if there wasn't skullduggery afoot. We challenged the current will on the basis, among other things, of lack of capacity on the deceased's part to make a valid will. If we won, the older will would have been granted probate. The other side defended it naturally. We carried the burden of proving lack of capacity. which is always difficult in those cases. We obtained discovery of the deceased's medical records from the state hospital. It turned out that the deceased was so severely demented by the time she made the current will that she was recorded as having answered the door to a care worker stark naked, among other more damning clinical assessments. The case settled on the basis of what we were claiming fairly quickly after that. Have worked in the courthouse legal system since I finished high school. Best moment was when I was observing court for domestic violence injunctions. Florida doesn't have generic restraining orders. An attorney, who also happened to be my best friend's dad, was poking holes in the lady's allegations against her lover. He ended his time with something along the lines of, "You claim that my client violated the temporary injunction by doing this. Yet you invited him over to the house, and you slept with him in the shower, in the bed, on the counter, and on the hood of the car, didn't you? Didn't you?" Then the judge looked over at her and said, "Well, did you?" Not a lawyer, but it was my case. Ex took me to court for custody. He did not get physical custody in the divorce, but the judge gave him away to earn equally shared custody, which is bizarre. But I digress. The judge flat out told him from the bench that violation of the custody order at all would nullify his chances at custody. It took him less than a week to do exactly that by introducing our children to his mistress before the divorce was actually final. He also stopped paying child support and alimony and a ton of other things. He fired his first lawyer the day before the divorce finalization hearing and went into the hearing asking for an extension, only for the judge to explain we were at the legal due date and that he'd heard the ex had a wedding already planned and would likely want to get divorced first. Anyway, we were back in court a year later with him going for custody. Not the last time that happened. The friend of the court recommended again no custody and barely more than supervised parenting time. We had tons of evidence. He had the best father's rights attorney in the whole area, and the case just went weird. I was interrogated on the stand for over half an hour about my knitting and spinning yarn, and how my hobbies took me away from my children while I did them in the same room as we watched movies, and how I spent child support money on yarn, but also how I had yarn the ex had paid for when we were married. I still have no idea what that was about. To his second wife, former mistress claimed she was going to vomit in front of our very pregnant FOC referee, and then switched between crying and yelling on the stand. 3. He called the kid's principal as a witness when she was the one who had banned his second wife from the school for harassing and threatening the kid's teachers, and also testified that he had almost zero contact with the school and their teachers. The real kicker. 3. His last piece of evidence was an email to him from his first lawyer telling him not to violate the court order by introducing the kids to his mistress the day before he did on our daughter's birthday. He claimed on the stand that the email said he could do just that, and that doing so was not a violation of the order. My lawyer took that apart beautifully, and then the referee started in and eviscerated him. He lost all physical and legal custody after that. As my lawyer often said, just when she thought she had a handle on how bizarre our case was, he'd go and do something out of deep left field. Not a lawyer, but do legal paternity stuff. Here's the big surprise. Someone thought they were not the father, and then they were the father. Or vice versa. Just living the big exciting molecular genetics adventure over here. Who? Have a friend who works with child protection services. Had a guy in for the routine "are you the father" thing. He was denying it and didn't want to pay. Takes the test and is not worried in the least. The result came back positive. The twist was why he wasn't worried. He figured he was the father. So he had a friend go in and take the test for him, similar enough looking to pass a quick driver license ID check. Turns out the friend was boinking his girlfriend on the sly. The guy ended up on the hook for child support payments, and it really wasn't his kid. He couldn't come forward without admitting he lied to the court and sent someone else in for the test. It came out later, but he still had a legal mess once you're legally determined as the father. Getting rid of support requirements is darn near impossible. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.